Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is a real honor to be here today with so many esteemed judges, prosecutors, government officials, and religious leaders, all united in our desire to use the legal system and the tools of justice to combat human trafficking. My boss, Secretary of State John Kerry, has called the fight against trafficking an issue of extreme moral clarity, and I could not agree more. I want to thank the Academy of Social Sciences and His Excellency Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. The combined power and influence of this audience can go a long way to eradicating human trafficking, which is nothing less than slavery in the 21st century. Human trafficking is an issue to which I have dedicated my career, first as an assistant United States attorney prosecuting human trafficking cases in my home state of Georgia, and now at the State Department as ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. As a former federal prosecutor, it is especially rewarding to travel to this summit with 4 United States federal judges who have specialized experience when it comes to trying human trafficking cases and who believe in the importance of the victim-centered approach, the rule of law, and seeing justice accomplished. Before we hear from their judicial perspective on human trafficking cases and learn from their experiences, I'd like to share a little bit about my office, the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. I'd prefer it if the combat came first, but it was already named before I got there. The TIP office, as we refer to ourselves for short, was established in 2000 by the United States Comprehensive Anti-Trafficking Law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It both leads U.S. global engagement on human trafficking and supports the coordination of our federal government efforts to combat trafficking at home. As ambassador of the TIP office, I lead the State Department's efforts to combat all forms of human trafficking through bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, targeted foreign assistance, and engagement with civil society to raise global awareness and prevent trafficking in persons. We may be best known for issuing the annual Trafficking in Persons reports, and I'm not going to give a sneak preview of any of the rankings today. But we also leverage our foreign assistance to help governments that wish to enhance their efforts to combat trafficking but lack the financial resources to do so. As of 2015, my office had more than 85 active anti-trafficking projects in more than 65 countries. For purposes of today's summit, I'd like to highlight some of our key training and technical assistance programs that focus on enhancing the rule of law by building both government and civil society capacity to combat trafficking. Last year, my office provided technical assistance to develop and improve laws, national action plans, and/or victim identification and referral mechanisms in several countries through implementing partners like UNODC and the International Organization for Migration. For example, we have funded efforts to assist with the drafting of legislation in Chad, Djibouti, Kenya, and Malaysia, to develop and implement national action plans in Guinea and the Republic of Congo, and enhance victim identification and referral mechanisms through workshops in Brazil, Madagascar, and Malawi. We seek to use our foreign assistance to train and equip criminal justice and security sectors to better investigate, prosecute, and punish the crime of trafficking, and to teach officials in those sectors how to effectively protect victims. In 2015, our grantees trained more than 200 criminal justice practitioners, including judges, magistrates, prosecutors, and law enforcement in 10 countries. Judges have been a core audience in our trainings in countries including Algeria, Barbados, Haiti, Jordan, Malaysia, Mongolia, Montenegro, Morocco, and Togo. For instance, for Mongolian judges, the training focused on victim-centered investigations and prosecutions, including techniques for interagency coordination and cooperation between law enforcement and NGO service providers. This training and technical assistance is paramount, but so is coordination and collaboration among and across agencies. As a former member of Atlanta, Georgia's Human Trafficking Task Force, I know from experience that government and NGOs must work together to better stabilize and protect victims. As a federal prosecutor, I could not have brought successful criminal cases without partnering with providers of essential victim services. In one case that you will hear about shortly, we asked the NGO service provider to assist the young women who were recovered when their traffickers were arrested. A year later, that same provider sat in court as the survivors testified. They were a familiar and friendly face at a time when the young women needed them there. And my time prosecuting cases has also taught me that we must be sure not to criminalize trafficking victims for nonviolent crimes committed as a result of their being trafficked. This is a persistent and pressing issue in the United States and around the world. I've already been fortunate enough to press this issue as part of my message in travels to Mexico, Cuba, Botswana, South Africa, and India. And some of my people I met with in Mexico are here today. It is essential that prosecutors and judges do their utmost to ensure that trafficking victims are treated as survivors of trafficking and afforded the dignity of being assisted, not harmed by the justice system meant to protect them. This is at the heart of the victim-centered approach to trafficking. And to assist in their recovery, we must also vacate the criminal records of victims wrongly convicted. It is equally important that officials, including police, prosecutors, judges, immigration officials, be trained to identify trafficking victims, prevent further victimization, and start the process towards recovery as soon as possible. And this is hard because trafficking victims do not self-identify. They have been threatened by traffickers, often physically abused, psychologically manipulated, and told that if they speak up, more harm will come to them or their loved ones. These tactics are the hidden forms of subtle violence outlined by Monsignor Sanchez Sorondo in the introduction papers to the summit. Training is essential because often well-intentioned law enforcement and judicial officers do not understand the many forms of trafficking or the circumstances that keep victims from coming forward. Ideally, training is specialized and institutionalized, and it's tailored to the specific audience, but also integrated into existing law enforcement training so it can outlive any changes of personnel. While judicial and law enforcement institutions will never be able to fully reverse the trauma of human trafficking, we can review and improve our laws and policies to strengthen our identification efforts and aid an individual's recovery by providing support to each victim on their journey towards becoming a survivor. To borrow the language again from the introduction, we should promote human dignity, freedom, happiness, and peace. I had the opportunity in February to address the U.S. States Attorneys General while they were all gathered in D.C. for their annual conference. I encourage these lawmakers in the U.S. to look at the laws in their states to vacate or expunge the criminal records of trafficking victims. And I encourage lawmakers and judges here to provide survivors the ability to seek a court order vacating or expunging criminal convictions entered against them resulting from their trafficking situation. Just by way of example, in 2010, New York became the first state in the United States to pass a law allowing survivors of trafficking to vacate their convictions for prostitution offenses. In 2013, Florida's law went even further, providing for the expungement of any conviction for an offense committed while a victim of human trafficking. These laws not only correct past injustices, but also help survivors move forward with their lives. It improves the survivor's ability to find work and housing. It reduces economic vulnerabilities and the risk of being re-trafficked. In the United States, we are listening to survivors and empowering them to draw upon their experiences and make recommendations to guide our government as it develops policies and programs to combat modern slavery. Last year, President Obama appointed the first U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. This is a council comprised of 11 survivors of sex and labor trafficking, and later this year they will release a report with recommendations to improve our federal anti-trafficking policies. We strive for a holistic approach to combating human trafficking that also includes targeted public awareness campaigns within communities, events with medical professionals, educators, community organizations. And this has a dual benefit. It increases the number of individuals who might report the crime to law enforcement. It also addresses demand. Further awareness efforts can increase the numbers of individuals who refuse to purchase commercial sex. Informed consumers are also more apt to ask companies where and how their goods are being made, and to insist that such companies effectively monitor and evaluate their global supply chains. Forced labor is found in supply chains around the world, and it is essential that governments and businesses examine their operations, work with their suppliers, and take steps to prevent forced labor in their global supply chains. As the largest purchaser of goods and services globally, the U.S. government has sought to ensure that its procurement practices are not contributing to modern slavery. We have an executive order which strengthens protections against human trafficking in government contracts. I know there's a UK law that we will hopefully hear about from Commissioner Hyland later, but even without such a law, each government can review its own procurement practices, and each government can implement the UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, known as the Palermo Protocol. And last year marked the 15th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol, and its central tenets of preventing the crime, protecting victims, and prosecuting traffickers continues to be our framework. We have seen the evolution of the protocol as some 169 countries are now party to it. We have also witnessed the establishment of a special rapporteur on trafficking in persons and a working group on trafficking in persons to facilitate implementation of the Palermo Protocol and make recommendations to states parties. Before we segue into the judge's presentation that we will hear over the next 2 days, I want to highlight how we can integrate the lessons learned from cases that have been prosecuted around the world and the survivors we have all met. One case I worked on involved 2 Nigerian girls who were lured into the United States, one after another, to be nannies in exchange for the opportunity to go to school and send money back home. Their trafficker kept them isolated and did not pay them. She held their travel documents, deprived them of sleep and food, forced them to sleep on the floor and bathe out of a bucket, even though she had plenty of rooms in her spacious home. Their isolation and lack of familiarity with the United States, as well as their own cultural sense of the respect owed to the trafficker as a community elder, increased their vulnerability to being trafficked by this woman. They were completely reliant on her. And cases like this demonstrate how many variables are at play in any given trafficking scheme, and also give us an idea of how challenging it is to uncover trafficking crimes. I mention this case in particular because it came to light when the second victim sought help from a church. The pastor there referred her to an anti-trafficking NGO who, with her permission, called the FBI to report the crime. And standing here today in this holy city, I note that faith and values can play a big role in motivating us to solve some of the world's most urgent problems. I believe this is true of human trafficking. I don't know if we can pull up 2 slides I brought. If we can switch to the slides for the U.S. presentation. So while I was prosecuting cases, I felt like I was working on the side of the angels. People used to say this is really challenging work, but I felt like I was doing the best work I've ever done. And I wanted you to hear from 2 survivors in their own words, which is a case I tried in front of Judge Richard Story, who will also address you today. The dreams, if we can find the slides, the dreams are on one slide of Rosalina, a young woman who wanted to be a teacher until she was trafficked into the U.S. and forced into prostitution. The other slide, which hopefully we will get to, involved a prayer from one of the victims that she wrote in her notebook while she was with the trafficker, asking God for the strength to go on. Yes, sir? Oh, excellent. So here's the slide with respect to Rosalina, where she just wrote down her goals and dreams, like many of us did when we were in our late teens and early 20s. She wanted to be a teacher. And the next slide is the prayer. Oh, I have a button. Thank you.
The red one.
The red one. The next slide is the prayer from Lorena. I know some of you speak Spanish as your first language. It's in Spanish on the left and then translated on the right. Yes, thank you. So we're going to begin these 2 days of sharing best practices, listening to each other and learning. And I ask you to keep these victims' dreams and prayers in your heart while we put our minds to the task of how to use our system of justice to eradicate trafficking. The implementation of strong legal instruments with a victim-centered approach can make a true difference. As my boss, Secretary Carey, who's also a former prosecutor, has said, justice is not simply a matter of having the right laws on the books. We have to back those words with resources, strategies, and actions that produce the right results. So thank you for being part of the solution, and I look forward to hearing the wisdom and practical advice from the judges and other officials during our training. And I'm going to segue, if it's all right, into the presentation with the U.S. judges who are here.